Development banks are again in fashion. China, probably because the country is not very satisfied with its representation in the established development banks, has recently called for the establishment of two new development banks. One is the so-called BRICS Bank, which will cater to activities in Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And very recently, in the new, China has called for the establishment of the new Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank. The purpose of these two banks will be somehow different, but will be very similar to existing institutions in Europe, the European Investment Bank, or in other parts of the world. Now, the reason for these banks to exist is because they are able to finance activities that the private sector is not interested, either because there's too much risk, or because the rewards are too long, or because there's a lot of uncertainty. But it's important to have clear in our minds that the development bank is very special animals, very special institutions. That to be justified in economic terms, they have to sustain two basic economic principles. One is called the subsidiarity principle, and the other one, the additionality principle. The subsidiarity principle means the development banks should not invest in activities that the private financial sector could invest. So they would add additional sources of financing to additional activities that the private sector would not be interested in. Now, the principle of additionality is even more complicated, because it tells us that even when the development bank participates in financing sectors or activities of the economy or social goods, it has to make sure that it adds additional value to the game. And in that sense, established banks like the Asian Development Bank or the African Development Bank have been questioned and challenged, because sometimes they have been referred to as doing business as usual, as not adding anything that the private sector can do. Now, of course, the reason why China is so interested in these banks is because it feels misrepresented or underrepresented in the established institutions, in the World Bank, in the Asian Development Bank. In that point, China is right. China has a point. China's representation in the governing bodies of these institutions is much lower than what corresponds to its size, potential, GDP growth, etc. And I would expect that this situation should be corrected in the immediate future. But I would also caution against the possibility of creating development banks as a substitute for emergent sovereign funds or for public banks, because development banks are not public institutions. They should make profit, and they should give credit in reasonable concessional terms that make the institution viable over the long term.